There are places on Earth where silence screams louder than any words. Places where history was written in the blood of the forgotten, with the tears of those who never returned home. As someone who has spent years researching the darker chapters of Eastern European history, from archives across the United States and Europe, I've learned that some of the most haunting stories emerge not from the grand narratives taught in schools, but from the hushed testimonies passed down through generations. Today, I want to share with you one such story, a story that successive Romanian governments tried for decades to erase from collective memory. In the heart of Dobruja, on the banks of the Danube River, stretches a deep scar in the landscape, the Danube-Black Sea Canal. For many tourists and shipping companies today, it represents an impressive technical achievement that cuts shipping distances by hundreds of kilometers. For historians and the families of victims, however, it is something far more sinister, the largest unmarked cemetery of communist Romania. This 64-kilometer waterway is not just a transport artery. It is a mass grave that preserves in its concrete walls and muddy banks the echo of the final words of thousands of innocent people. It is the story of a megalomaniacal dream that became an entire nation's nightmare, a testament to how quickly civilization can descend into barbarism when ideology overrides humanity. But this story begins long before the first pickaxe struck the Dobruja soil. It begins in the smoke-filled offices of Bucharest in the winter of 1949, when Romanian communist leader Gheorghe Gheorghiu Dej was feeling the intense pressure from Moscow to prove his loyalty to Stalin's vision of rapid socialist development. Stalin himself had drawn up an ambitious blueprint for Eastern Europe's transformation. Each satellite state received its grand project. Poland got the massive Nowa Huta steel complex, Czechoslovakia expanded its industrial capacity with enlarged Škoda factories, and East Germany rebuilt its heavy industry. For Romania, Stalin's planners had conceived something even more ambitious, a canal that would fundamentally alter the geography of southeastern Europe by connecting the Danube directly to the Black Sea. The project wasn't entirely new. Various rulers throughout history had dreamed of such a waterway. The Ottoman Turks had surveyed possible routes in the 17th century. King Carol II's government had commissioned studies in the 1930s. Even Hitler's engineers had examined the feasibility during World War II. But what Dej proposed was radically different, a canal built entirely through patriotic labor by Romanian citizens, without foreign expertise, without Western technology, and most crucially, without paying wages to the workforce. For Dej, this represented far more than an economic opportunity or even a demonstration of loyalty to Moscow. In his mind, the canal project offered the perfect solution to what communist documents referred to as the hostile elements problem. These hostile elements included a vast cross-section of Romanian society, intellectuals who questioned Marxist orthodoxy, Orthodox priests who refused to subordinate their teachings to communist ideology, peasants who resisted agricultural collectivization, former members of the historical political parties, anyone with Western education or connections, and essentially anyone whose loyalty to the new regime appeared questionable. How many lives did the Dobruja soil ultimately swallow? Why did successive Romanian governments maintain official silence for nearly 7 decades? What secrets still remain locked in classified archives? Who were the architects and executioners of this systematic horror? And remarkably, how many of them lived comfortably to old age without ever facing justice? Today, drawing from declassified documents, survivor testimonies, and recently opened archives, I want to reveal the documented truth about what historians now recognize as one of the most concentrated episodes of state terror in 20th century European history. This is a story that Romanian authorities spent enormous effort trying to erase from collective memory, but which survivors courageously transmitted in whispers and written fragments, passing the truth from generation to generation until it could finally be told openly. The canal exists today as a functioning waterway, but beneath its waters and along its banks lie the unmarked graves of thousands who died building it. Their stories demand to be heard, not for revenge, but so that such horrors never happen again anywhere in the world. To understand the true horror of what became known as the Canal of Death, we must first understand the man who conceived it and the political climate that made such a monstrous project possible. Gheorghe Gheorghiu Dej was not merely another communist functionary following orders from Moscow. He was a calculating political survivor who saw opportunity in brutality and efficiency in mass murder. Born Gheorghe Gheorghiu in 1901, he added Dej to his name after the Transylvanian town where he spent his early political career. Unlike many communist leaders who came to power through intellectual or revolutionary credentials, Dej rose through the ranks as a pragmatic organizer with an exceptional talent for eliminating rivals and consolidating power. By 1947, he had successfully maneuvered himself into the leadership of Romania, but his position remained precarious. The year 1949 represented a critical moment in Eastern European communist consolidation. Stalin was growing increasingly paranoid about the loyalty of his satellite states, particularly after Yugoslavia's Josip Broz Tito successfully broke away from Soviet control. The Soviet leader demanded visible, dramatic demonstrations of loyalty from remaining Eastern Bloc countries. Moreover, Stalin's post-war economic policy emphasized massive infrastructure projects that would both demonstrate socialist superiority and create productive capacity for future conflicts with the West. The pressure on Dej was immense and multifaceted. Moscow was demanding proof of Romania's commitment to the communist bloc through concrete achievements. Domestically, Dej faced significant opposition from multiple directions. The remnants of the historical political parties still maintained underground networks. The Orthodox Church commanded widespread popular loyalty. The peasantry was actively resisting collectivization efforts, and even within the Communist Party itself, rival factions questioned his leadership. The Canal project emerged from this perfect storm of international pressure and domestic opposition as a brutal but elegant solution to multiple problems simultaneously. Historical documents from the period reveal that Dej's inner circle understood from the beginning that the canal would serve as both an economic project and a vast concentration camp system designed to eliminate political opposition through systematic overwork, malnutrition, and exposure. Archive materials from the Romanian Workers' Party Central Committee, declassified decades later, show that initial planning sessions in late 1949 explicitly discussed the project's dual purpose. While public propaganda would emphasize the canal's economic benefits and its role in Romanian national development, internal party documents make clear that the project's primary function was what they termed social cleansing through forced labor. The selection process for deportation to the canal worksites was systematic and comprehensive. Lists were compiled throughout 1949 and early 1950, with contributions from the Securitate, secret police, local party organizations, workplace informants, and even neighborhood committees. The categories of people marked for deportation were extensive: former politicians and civil servants from the pre-communist era, military officers who had served in World War II, intellectuals and university professors who had not demonstrated sufficient enthusiasm for the new regime, Orthodox priests and other religious figures, successful peasants who owned more than modest plots of land, small business owners and merchants, and anyone who had maintained contact with Western countries or expressed skepticism about communist policies. What made this systematic persecution particularly insidious was its legal facade. Rather than conducting mass arrests without pretext, the authorities developed an elaborate framework of administrative procedures that gave the appearance of judicial process while ensuring predetermined outcomes. Special courts were established with streamlined procedures that could process hundreds of cases per day. Typical charges included sabotage of socialist construction, propaganda against the state, economic crimes against the people, and the catch-all category of activities hostile to the working class. The sentences were uniformly harsh but varied in their official justification. Some individuals received specific prison terms ranging from 5 to 25 years, while others were sentenced to indefinite re-education through labor, with release contingent upon demonstration of proper socialist consciousness. In practice, these distinctions were largely meaningless. All those sentenced found themselves in the same camps, facing the same conditions, with the same minimal chances of survival. International context played a crucial role in enabling the project's horrific scope. The early 1950s marked the height of the Cold War's initial phase, with Western attention focused primarily on the Korean conflict and the broader confrontation with Soviet power. Western intelligence services had limited penetration into Romania, and even when reports of mass deportations and camp conditions reached the outside world, they were often dismissed as exaggerated propaganda or were overshadowed by larger geopolitical concerns. The Romanian Orthodox Church, which might have served as a voice of moral opposition, found itself systematically neutralized. Senior hierarchs were either co-opted through promises of maintaining institutional autonomy or were themselves arrested and deported to the camps. Local priests who attempted to speak out about disappearing parishioners were quickly silenced through arrest or transfer to remote locations. The propaganda machinery supporting the Canal project was sophisticated and comprehensive. State-controlled media presented the canal as a patriotic endeavor that would demonstrate Romanian engineering capabilities and contribute to national economic development. Newspapers regularly published photographs of supposedly enthusiastic workers, articles about technical innovations, and interviews with volunteers who expressed gratitude for the opportunity to contribute to socialist construction. Cultural institutions were mobilized to support the project's public image. Writers were commissioned to produce novels and poems celebrating the heroic labor of canal builders. Composers created symphonic works inspired by the project's grandeur. Artists painted idealized scenes of collective effort and socialist brotherhood. Film crews produced documentary shorts showing the progress of construction and the dedication of workers. This cultural campaign served multiple purposes. It provided positive content to fill state-controlled media. It created a narrative framework that made questioning the project seem unpatriotic, and it provided employment and status for intellectuals who might otherwise have been tempted to join the opposition. The gap between this propaganda version of the Canal project and the reality in the work camps was so enormous that it represented one of the most sustained campaigns of systematic deception in modern European history. The morning of June 15, 1950, marked the beginning of what survivors would later call the descent into hell. The first convoy of deportees, packed into cattle cars without windows, water, or sanitation facilities, arrived at what would become the Poarta Albă camp after a journey of 3 days from Bucharest. What greeted them upon arrival was a carefully designed system of dehumanization that had been months in the planning. The camp infrastructure itself revealed the calculated nature of the entire operation. This was not a hastily improvised detention facility, but a purposefully designed instrument of systematic brutality. The layout followed principles developed by Soviet camp planners, adapted for local conditions and specific objectives. The camps were positioned strategically along the projected canal route, with the largest and most sophisticated facilities located at key points where the most difficult excavation work needed to be completed. Poarta Albă, the largest and most notorious of the canal camps, housed up to 15,000 prisoners at its peak capacity. The facility consisted of dozens of wooden barracks arranged in a grid pattern, each building designed to house 200 to 300 individuals in conditions that would be considered inhumane for livestock. The barracks themselves were constructed with minimal materials. Wooden planks with gaps that provided no protection against winter cold or summer heat, roofs that leaked during rain, and no insulation or heating systems. Surrounding the entire complex was a sophisticated security apparatus designed to prevent escape and maintain psychological pressure on the inmates. Multiple rows of barbed wire fencing, some electrified, created concentric barriers around the living areas. Guard towers positioned at regular intervals provided constant surveillance with searchlights that swept the camp throughout the night. The guards themselves were specially selected for their loyalty to the regime and their willingness to use extreme violence against prisoners. The daily routine in the camps was designed not merely to extract maximum labor from the prisoners, but to systematically break their spirit and destroy their sense of human dignity. The day began before dawn, typically around 4 a.m., with a violent awakening process that set the tone for everything that followed. Guards would enter the barracks with clubs and dogs, shouting orders and beating anyone who did not immediately rise and prepare for the day's work. Prisoners were given approximately 10 minutes to dress and prepare themselves before being forced into formation for the morning roll call. This process, known as a peel, could last for hours as guards deliberately miscounted, searched for missing individuals, or simply used the time to humiliate and intimidate the assembled prisoners. During winter months, prisoners were forced to stand motionless in freezing temperatures, wearing only the thin clothing they had been given, with many collapsing from exposure during these extended roll calls. The food system represented one of the most calculated aspects of the camp's brutality. Meals were designed to provide just enough nutrition to keep prisoners barely functional for hard labor, but not enough to maintain health or strength over time. The typical daily ration consisted of a small portion of watery soup containing minimal vegetables and occasional scraps of meat, along with a small piece of black bread that was often moldy or infested with insects. Water was another instrument of control and suffering. Clean drinking water was limited and often contaminated, leading to widespread dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases that swept through the camps regularly. Prisoners were forced to drink from the same sources used for washing and waste disposal, creating a constant cycle of illness that further weakened their ability to work and survive. The work itself was the central element of the camp system, and it was designed to be literally backbreaking. Prisoners were marched to excavation sites each morning, often walking for hours to reach their assigned work areas. The march itself was a form of torture, with guards forcing the column to maintain rapid pace while beating anyone who stumbled or fell behind. Sick and elderly prisoners who could not keep up were often simply left beside the road to die. At the work sites, prisoners were required to excavate the canal using only the most primitive tools: hand shovels, pickaxes, and wooden wheelbarrows. The daily quotas were set at impossible levels. Each prisoner was expected to move several cubic meters of earth and rock per day, working 12 to 14 hours under constant supervision. The guards used a system of individual and group punishment to maintain productivity. Prisoners who failed to meet their quotas had their food rations reduced, while entire work groups could be punished if overall productivity fell below expectations. The physical conditions of the excavation work were deliberately harsh. Prisoners worked in all weather conditions, through freezing winter temperatures, scorching summer heat, and driving rain. Safety equipment was non-existent, and industrial accidents were common and often fatal. Prisoners were required to work with heavy machinery and explosives without proper training or protection, leading to frequent injuries from cave-ins, explosions, and equipment failures. Medical care in the camps was essentially non-existent, serving more as a final stage of the dying process than any genuine attempt at treatment. The camp infirmaries were overcrowded, unsanitary barracks where sick prisoners were sent to die out of sight of the healthy workers. Medical supplies were extremely limited, and the few medical personnel in the camps were often prisoners themselves, lacking both resources and authority to provide meaningful treatment. The systematic nature of the brutality extended to every aspect of daily life. Prisoners were subjected to constant psychological torture through arbitrary rule changes, collective punishment for individual infractions, and deliberate humiliation designed to destroy their sense of self-worth. Guards organized competitions between work groups that pitted prisoners against each other for marginally better rations or slightly less brutal working conditions, creating internal conflicts that prevented solidarity and organized resistance. Sexual violence was another tool of control and dehumanization. While detailed documentation of these crimes is limited due to the shame and trauma experienced by victims, survivor testimonies make clear that both male and female prisoners were subjected to sexual assault and abuse by guards as a means of asserting power and breaking resistance. Women prisoners who were housed in separate sections of some camps faced particular vulnerability, with reports of systematic rape and forced prostitution among the guard personnel. The winter months represented a particularly deadly period in the camps. Temperatures in the Dobruja region regularly dropped below 10 degrees Celsius, 14 degrees Celsius, and the unheated barracks provided no protection against the cold. Prisoners slept fully clothed, often sharing blankets and huddling together for warmth, but many simply froze to death during the night. Each morning brought the grim routine of removing frozen corpses from the barracks and adding their names to the growing death rolls. Hunger became a constant obsession that drove prisoners to desperate measures. Some attempted to eat grass, bark, or any organic material that might provide nutrition. Others traded personal possessions, including clothing needed for warmth, in exchange for small portions of food. The psychological effects of chronic starvation included hallucinations, violent mood swings, and complete breakdown of social norms among prisoners. The disposal of the dead became a major logistical challenge as mortality rates climbed throughout 1951 and 1952. Initially, individual graves were dug for deceased prisoners, but as deaths mounted, mass graves became the standard practice. These burial sites were located away from the main camp areas to avoid demoralizing living prisoners and to conceal the scale of the mortality from potential outside observers. Documentation from former camp personnel, obtained years later through various sources, indicates that mortality rates varied significantly between different camps and time periods, but consistently remained at levels that would be considered genocidal. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 15–20% of all prisoners deported to the canal projects died during their imprisonment, with some facilities and time periods showing much higher death rates. The systematic nature of this brutality was not accidental or the result of incompetent administration. Rather, it represented a carefully planned policy of elimination through exhaustion, designed to remove perceived political opponents from Romanian society while extracting maximum economic value from their labor before they died. The canal project served as both a massive public works program and a slow-motion genocide, hidden from international view by effective propaganda and information control. To truly understand the magnitude of the Canal of Death tragedy, we must move beyond statistics and examine the individual human stories, the faces, names, and personal histories of those who were swept up in this systematic horror. These were not abstract enemies of the state or dangerous criminals, but ordinary people whose only crime was existing in a society that had suddenly redefined humanity itself along ideological lines. Professor Ion Ioanid represents one category of victim, the intellectual class that communist authorities viewed as particularly dangerous. A respected historian and educator, Ioanid had spent decades building Romania's academic institutions and training young scholars. His books on Romanian history were widely used in universities, and his reputation extended throughout Europe. Yet in the spring of 1951, his life was shattered by a pre-dawn arrest that would lead him to Poarta Alba camp. Ioanid's crime was subtle, but in the eyes of the regime, unforgivable. His historical writings had failed to emphasize class struggle as the driving force of Romanian development, and he had maintained correspondence with Western academic colleagues even after the communist takeover. In his memoirs, written decades later, he described the shock of realizing that his life's work had been transformed overnight into evidence of treason against the state. The experience of arrival at the camp was particularly traumatic for intellectuals like Ioanid, who had lived comfortable lives and had little experience with physical hardship. "When I stepped off the cattle car after 3 days without food or water," he wrote, "I saw a landscape that seemed designed by evil itself. The barbed wire stretched beyond the horizon, the guard towers loomed like monuments to cruelty, and the faces of the guards showed no trace of human compassion." Corneliu Coposu's story illustrates another dimension of the canal tragedy, the systematic elimination of political opposition. As secretary to Iuliu Maniu, leader of the National Peasant Party, Coposu had been one of Romania's most prominent democratic politicians before the communist takeover. His arrest in 1947 was part of a broader campaign to eliminate all traces of the pre-war political system. But his sentence to forced labor on the canal represented a particularly vindictive form of punishment. Coposu would spend 7 years in various canal camps, witnessing horrors that would remain with him for the rest of his life. In later interviews, he described how the communist authorities seemed particularly focused on breaking the spirits of former political leaders, subjecting them to additional humiliations and targeting them for the most dangerous work assignments. "They wanted us not just to die," he recalled, "but to die broken and degraded, so that even our memory could not inspire others." The clergy represented another major category of canal victims, as the communist regime viewed organized religion as a fundamental threat to its totalitarian control. Father Dumitru Staniloae, who would later become one of Romania's most respected Orthodox theologians, experienced the canal camps as both personal torment and spiritual testing. His arrest came after he refused pressure to publicly endorse the regime's policies from his pulpit. Staniloae's theological training provided him with intellectual resources for understanding and coping with the camp experience, but it also made him a particular target for guards who seemed determined to force him to renounce his faith. "They created conditions designed to make us curse God," he later wrote. "The hunger, the cold, the constant brutality were not just punishment. They were attempts to prove that faith was meaningless in the face of absolute power." The story of the Cantacuzino family illustrates perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the canal tragedy: the destruction of entire families. Prince Constantine Cantacuzino, a distinguished historian and diplomat, was arrested along with his wife Maria and their 3 children, Radu, 16, Ioana, 12, and little Anna, 8. The family's aristocratic background made them obvious targets for a regime that viewed the old elite as inherently hostile to socialist values. The children's experience in the camps represents one of the most horrific aspects of the entire canal project. Young Anna, barely 8 years old, could not understand why she was separated from her toys, her room, her normal life, and thrust into a world of hunger, cold, and constant fear. She survived less than 2 months, dying of dysentery in the overcrowded, unsanitary camp infirmary, while her parents were forbidden from staying with her. Maria Cantacuzino never recovered from watching her youngest child die in such conditions. Witnesses reported that she spent her remaining time in camp talking to her dead daughter, refusing to acknowledge the reality of her death. She survived until 1953, but her mind had essentially died with Anna in 1951. Constantine himself died just weeks before the general amnesty that would have freed him, his body finally succumbing to the accumulated effects of 3 years of starvation and overwork. The peasant victims of the canal represent the largest single category of deportees, as rural resistance to collectivization provided authorities with a massive pool of potential prisoners. Gheorghe Popescu from Olt County exemplifies this group. A successful farmer with 15 hectares of land who had built a prosperous life through decades of hard work. His crime was refusing to surrender his property to the newly established collective farm in his village. Popescu was arrested along with his 2 teenage sons, Mihai and Ion, in what became a common pattern of eliminating entire families that might serve as focal points for continued resistance. The irony of his situation was particularly bitter. A man who had spent his life working the land was now forced to dig a canal under conditions that made productive agriculture impossible. His agricultural knowledge was useless in the camps, where the soil was rocky and the work was purely destructive. The death of Popescu's sons within their first winter illustrates the particular vulnerability of young people in the camps. Teenagers and young adults, who might have been expected to survive better than older prisoners, often succumbed quickly to diseases that spread rapidly in the overcrowded barracks. Mihai died of typhus in December 1951, followed 2 weeks later by Ion, who had been weakened by watching his brothers suffering and had lost the will to fight for survival. Students and young intellectuals faced their own particular horrors in the camps. Mihai Radulescu, a philosophy student at Bucharest University, had been arrested for possession of books by authors now classified as hostile to the people, including works by Mircea Eliade and Constantin Noica that had been standard academic texts just months before. His arrest came during a systematic purge of university students designed to eliminate potential sources of intellectual opposition to the regime. Radulescu's education, which should have been an asset, became a liability in the camps. Guards seemed to take particular pleasure in humiliating educated prisoners, assigning them to the most degrading tasks and mocking their inability to perform physical labor. "They would force us to recite Marxist slogans while carrying heavy loads," one survivor recalled, "and beat us if we showed any sign of irony or resistance." Women prisoners faced additional horrors in the canal camps. including systematic sexual abuse that was used as both a tool of control and a form of entertainment for the guards. Ana Maria Georgescu, a teacher from Bucharest arrested for counter-revolutionary propaganda, she had expressed doubts about collectivization in a private conversation, spent 2 years in camp conditions that were specifically designed to break female prisoners. The psychological torture of women prisoners included being forced to work in men's clothing, having their heads shaved, and being denied basic hygiene facilities. Many women reported that the destruction of their feminine identity was as traumatic as the physical hardships, representing a calculated assault on their sense of self that continued long after their physical wounds had healed. Foreign prisoners added an international dimension to the Canal tragedy. Citizens of other countries who had been caught in Romania during the communist takeover found themselves swept up in the arrests, with their foreign nationality providing no protection against deportation to the camps. German ethnic minorities, Jewish refugees trying to reach Israel, and even Soviet citizens who had somehow fallen afoul of the authorities all found themselves digging the canal alongside Romanian prisoners. The medical professionals imprisoned in the camps faced particular moral anguish, as they were often forced to watch fellow prisoners die of treatable conditions while being denied the resources to provide care. Dr. Vasile Voiculescu, a respected physician from Bucharest, was assigned to work in the camp infirmary at Saligny, where he found himself presiding over what he later described as systematic medical murder. "I had sworn an oath to preserve life," he wrote in his memoirs, "but in the camps I was reduced to recording deaths and trying to provide comfort to the dying. The authorities gave us no medicines, no clean bandages, no proper facilities. We were doctors in name only, witnesses to a massive crime against humanity disguised as medical care." Children born in the camps represent perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire experience. Some women arrived pregnant, while others became pregnant through rape or the rare consensual relationships that developed even under such horrific conditions. These children were born into hell, with no hope of proper nutrition, medical care, or normal development. Most died within their first year, and those who survived faced psychological damage that would affect them for their entire lives. The guards themselves, while perpetrators of these crimes, sometimes provide insight into how ordinary people can be transformed into instruments of systematic brutality. Many were young men from rural backgrounds who had been selected for their political reliability and their willingness to follow orders without question. Some were themselves products of the communist education system and genuinely believed they were serving the cause of progress by brutalizing enemies of the people. Yet even among the guards, there were occasional moments of humanity that survivors remembered with gratitude. Small acts of kindness, sharing a piece of bread, looking the other way during a minor infraction, or simply treating a prisoner as a human being rather than an object, took on enormous significance in an environment designed to eliminate all traces of human compassion. The systematic concealment of the Canal of Death represents one of the most comprehensive and successful cover-up operations in modern European history. This was not a haphazard effort to minimize embarrassing revelations, but a carefully planned and executed campaign to eliminate every trace of evidence that could document the scope and nature of the crimes committed in the name of socialist construction. The cover-up began even before the camps were fully dismantled. As early as 1952, when it became clear that Stalin's death would likely lead to policy changes throughout the Eastern Bloc, Romanian authorities began implementing what internal documents referred to as the cleaning operation. This involved not just the destruction of physical evidence, but the systematic elimination of witnesses, documents, and any other traces that could be used to reconstruct the true history of the Canal project. Document destruction was carried out with military precision. Entire archives were removed from government buildings and transported to secret locations where they were systematically burned or otherwise destroyed. The operation was so thorough that decades later, when researchers finally gained access to state archives, they found enormous gaps in the official record corresponding exactly to the Canal project period. Entire series of documents that should have existed simply vanished, as if the bureaucratic machinery of the state had simply stopped functioning for several years. the physical elimination of evidence was equally comprehensive. Camp structures were not simply abandoned, but were systematically destroyed using explosives and heavy machinery. Guard towers were toppled, barracks were reduced to splinters, and even the foundation stones were broken up and scattered. The sites were then ploughed and planted with crops, creating an agricultural landscape that gave no hint of the industrial-scale murder that had taken place there. Mass grave sites received particular attention from the cover-up operation. Teams of workers, often prisoners from other camps who were subsequently eliminated themselves, were brought in to exhume bodies from the temporary burial sites around the camps. The remains were then transported to remote locations and reburied in unmarked graves that were carefully camouflaged and, in many cases, covered with concrete to prevent future discovery. Geographic evidence was systematically falsified. New maps were produced that showed the canal region as it appeared after the cover-up, with no indication that major construction or population centers had ever existed there. Place names associated with the camps were changed or eliminated entirely. Even aerial photographs from the period were either destroyed or altered to remove evidence of the camp infrastructure. Witness elimination took several forms. Many prisoners who had survived the camps were not released in 1953, but were instead transferred to other prisons, where they died under mysterious circumstances or were executed outright. Others were released, but then rearrested on new charges and disappeared into the prison system permanently. Even former guards and administrative personnel who might have been able to testify about the camp's operation were systematically eliminated or relocated to positions where they could not speak freely about their experiences. The few survivors who were actually released found themselves subject to intense surveillance and intimidation, designed to prevent them from sharing their experiences with others. They were required to sign documents promising never to discuss their imprisonment, and they were regularly visited by Securitate agents who reminded them that any violation of this agreement would result in immediate rearrest. Many survivors later reported that the psychological pressure continued for decades, with periodic reminders that the state was still watching them. Local populations who had witnessed the camp's operation were also systematically silenced. Entire villages in the canal region were forcibly relocated, with residents scattered across the country and forbidden from returning to their former homes. Those who remained were subjected to such intense pressure and surveillance that most chose voluntary silence rather than risk the consequences of speaking out. The propaganda machinery that had supported the canal project was smoothly redirected to support the cover-up effort. The same media outlets that had celebrated the canal's construction now simply stopped mentioning it entirely. Articles about regional development focused on other projects, and when the canal was mentioned at all, it was presented as a purely technical engineering challenge with no discussion of the human costs involved in its construction. Cultural products that had celebrated the canal project were systematically removed from circulation. Books were withdrawn from libraries and destroyed, films were removed from distribution, and even sheet music for songs about the canal was collected and burned. Artists and writers who had participated in the propaganda effort were encouraged to focus their talents on other subjects, with the clear understanding that continued references to the canal would end their careers. The education system played a crucial role in the long-term success of the cover-up. History textbooks were revised to eliminate all references to the canal project during the 1950-1953 period. Teachers were instructed to focus on other aspects of socialist construction during this period, and any student who raised questions about the canal was discouraged or punished. An entire generation of Romanians grew up with no knowledge that the canal had been built with forced labor or that thousands had died in its construction. International isolation helped make the cover-up possible. Romania's position within the Soviet bloc meant that Western intelligence services had limited access to information about internal developments. The few reports that did reach the outside world were often dismissed as Cold War propaganda, or were overshadowed by larger geopolitical concerns. International media had almost no presence in Romania during this period, and diplomatic contacts were so limited that systematic atrocities could be carried out without attracting significant external attention. Legal mechanisms were established to criminalize any attempt to discuss or investigate the canal project. Laws against defaming the state and spreading hostile propaganda were written broadly enough to criminalize virtually any factual statement about the camps or their operation. Even decades later, these laws remained in effect and were occasionally used to intimidate researchers or journalists who attempted to investigate the canal's history. The medical system was co-opted into the cover-up effort. Doctors who had treated camp survivors were instructed to modify their medical records to eliminate any reference to deportation after effects or other indicators that might suggest systematic mistreatment. Death certificates for camp victims were falsified to show natural causes of death or were simply never issued at all. The entire medical establishment was essentially forced to participate in concealing evidence of mass murder. Religious institutions were also pressed into service for the cover-up. Orthodox priests were instructed not to offer prayers for the dead from the canal camps, and families were discouraged from holding memorial services that might draw attention to missing relatives. Church records that might have documented the disappearance of parishioners were confiscated or destroyed. The spiritual dimension of the cover-up was particularly cruel, as it denied families the religious consolation that might have helped them process their losses. The success of the cover-up was so complete that even today, more than 70 years after the events, the full scope of the canal tragedy remains unknown. While some documentation has survived and some survivors have been able to share their testimonies, enormous gaps remain in the historical record. Conservative estimates suggest that tens of thousands died in the canal camps, but the true number may never be known because the evidence was so systematically destroyed. Perhaps most remarkably, many of the individuals responsible for both the original crimes and the subsequent cover-up lived comfortable lives and died natural deaths without ever being held accountable for their actions. Some even received state honors and pensions for their service to socialism. The culture of impunity that protected these criminals sent a clear message to Romanian society about the relative value of truth and political convenience. The supreme irony of the Canal of Death is that after consuming thousands of lives and enormous resources, the project was abruptly abandoned in March 1953, just weeks after Stalin's death. The decision to halt construction came not from any recognition of the human costs involved, but from purely political calculations about changing Soviet priorities and the new leadership's desire to distance itself from the most extreme policies of the Stalin era. The abandonment process was as systematic as the construction had been brutal. Work stopped literally overnight, with prisoners simply walking away from their excavation sites and returning to their barracks to await further orders. The partially completed canal sections were left exactly as they stood, creating an eerie industrial landscape that resembled an archaeological site from some failed civilization. The logistical challenges of dismantling the camp system were enormous. At the time of abandonment, the various canal camps held approximately 60,000 prisoners, along with thousands of guards, administrators, and support personnel. The sudden decision to halt the project created an immediate crisis. What to do with this vast population that had been assembled for a purpose that no longer existed? The solution was characteristically brutal and efficient. Healthier prisoners were transferred to other labor camps or regular prisons to complete their sentences under different pretexts. The sick and elderly were often simply released, though many died within weeks of their release, their bodies too damaged by years of maltreatment to survive in the outside world. A significant number of prisoners simply disappeared during this transition period, with no official record of their fate. The abandoned canal cuts themselves became monuments to the project's failure and the regime's brutality. For several years, the partially excavated sections remained visible from the main roads in the region, serving as unintentional reminders of the thousands who had died trying to complete the work. Local residents reported that the sites had an eerie, haunted quality, with wild animals avoiding the areas and vegetation growing strangely around the disturbed earth. Weather and neglect gradually softened the harsh lines of the excavations, but traces remained visible for decades. Aerial photographs from the 1960s and 1970s still show clear evidence of the abandoned construction sites, though these images were not generally available to the public and were classified as state secrets until long after the communist regime's collapse. The project remained officially dormant until 1976, when Nicolae Ceausescu, in his characteristic megalomania, announced that Romania would complete the canal as part of his grand plan to transform the country's geography and economy. The resumption of work represented both continuity and change. Continuity in the underlying arrogance and disregard for human costs that had characterized the original project, but change in that the new construction would rely on paid workers, modern equipment, and international technical expertise. The second phase of canal construction, which lasted from 1976 to 1984, was an entirely different kind of project. Ceausescu's decision to complete the canal was driven by multiple factors. Economically, he believed that the waterway would boost Romania's position in international trade by providing a more efficient route for shipping between Central Europe and the Mediterranean. Politically, he saw the project as a demonstration of Romania's technical capabilities and his own leadership effectiveness. Psychologically, completing the canal would represent a triumph over the failures of his predecessors and cement his legacy as the leader who could accomplish what others could not. The international context of the 1970s and 1980s also favored canal completion. Détente between East and West had created opportunities for technology transfer that had not existed in the earlier period. Western companies were eager to participate in large-scale infrastructure projects in Eastern Europe, and international lending institutions were willing to finance such projects as part of broader economic development strategies. The technical challenges of completing the canal were formidable, but not insurmountable with modern equipment and expertise. The route required cutting through several major geographical obstacles, including high ridges and underground water sources that had not been properly surveyed during the original construction. Advanced engineering techniques, including controlled explosions and precision excavation, made it possible to complete work that would have been impossible with the primitive methods available in the 1950s. The human cost of the second construction phase was minimal compared to the earlier period, but it was not zero. Industrial accidents, though infrequent, did occur, and several workers died during the 8-year construction period. However, these deaths were investigated, reported, and compensated according to normal industrial safety standards, representing a completely different approach to human life than had prevailed during the forced labor period. The canal was finally completed and officially opened on May 26, 1984, in a ceremony that represented one of Ceausescu's greatest propaganda triumphs. The opening celebration included international dignitaries, technical experts, and media coverage that presented the waterway as a marvel of socialist engineering and a testament to Romanian determination and capability. The irony of the celebration was profound. The same route that had been excavated initially through the forced labor and death of thousands of prisoners was now celebrated as a triumph of human achievement and technical progress. No mention was made during the opening ceremonies of the earlier construction phase or the human costs that had been paid for the first 20 kilometers of the canal's length. Since its completion, the Danube Black Sea Canal has functioned as intended, providing a shortened route for commercial shipping between the Danube River system and the Black Sea ports. The waterway handles millions of tons of cargo annually and has generated significant revenue for the Romanian economy. From a purely technical standpoint, the canal has been successful, justifying the engineering decisions and investment that went into its completion. However, the canal's commercial success has been accompanied by a profound historical amnesia that continues to this day. Tourist boats that cruise the waterway carry passengers who admire the engineering accomplishments and enjoy the scenic landscape, with no indication that they are traveling over one of Europe's largest unmarked graveyards. The canal's official history, as presented in government publications and tourist materials, begins with the 1976 resumption of construction, completely omitting the earlier period and its human costs. This historical amnesia extends to the physical landscape itself. The areas where the major camps were located have been converted to agricultural use or light industrial development, with no markers or memorials to indicate what happened there. A visitor to the region today would find no indication that it had been the site of systematic murder and systematic cover-up on an industrial scale. The process of uncovering the truth about the Canal of Death has been long, difficult, and incomplete. For nearly 4 decades after the project's abandonment, the very existence of the forced labor camps remained a carefully guarded state secret, known only to survivors, perpetrators, and the families of victims, all of whom had compelling reasons to remain silent. The first cracks in the wall of silence appeared in the late 1980s, as Ceausescu's regime began to weaken, and international pressure for human rights improvements created some space for limited discussion of previously forbidden topics. However, even these early revelations were fragmentary and often came from sources outside Romania, such as exile organizations or Western intelligence services that had gradually pieced together information about the camps. The 1989 revolution that toppled Ceausescu created the first real opportunity for systematic investigation of the Canal tragedy. In the chaos and euphoria that followed the regime's collapse, survivors began to speak publicly about their experiences. Journalists started investigating long-suppressed stories, and researchers gained access to previously classified archives. However, the transition period also presented significant obstacles to truth-seeking efforts. Many of the key documents that would have provided definitive evidence about the camp's operation had been systematically destroyed during the cover-up operations of the 1950s and 1960s. The surviving documentation was scattered across multiple archives, often misfiled or deliberately obscured, to prevent easy discovery. Additionally, many potential witnesses were elderly or had died during the long decades of enforced silence, taking their knowledge with them to their graves. The Association of Former Political Prisoners, founded in early 1990, played a crucial role in collecting and preserving survivor testimonies. Working with minimal resources and facing continued resistance from former communist officials who had retained positions in the new government, the association conducted hundreds of interviews with camp survivors and attempted to create a comprehensive record of what had happened during the Canal project. These interviews revealed not only the scope and brutality of the camp system, but also the remarkable psychological resilience of many survivors. Despite decades of official denial and social pressure to remain silent, many former prisoners had maintained detailed memories of their experiences and were eager to share them once it became safe to do so. Their testimonies provided the human dimension that was missing from the sparse official documentation. Academic researchers, particularly historians specializing in the communist period, began systematic investigations of the Canal project in the 1990s. However, their work was hampered by the destruction of official records, the advanced age of surviving witnesses, and the continued sensitivity of the topic in Romanian society. Many Romanians, including some who had not been directly involved in the camps, preferred not to confront the full extent of what had been done in their country's name. International scholars and human rights organizations also became involved in documenting the Canal tragedy. The parallels with better documented camp systems in other communist countries provided analytical frameworks for understanding the Romanian experience, while international pressure helped overcome some of the domestic resistance to truth-seeking efforts. The process of declassifying relevant government archives was slow and contentious. Even after the fall of communism, many former officials argued that releasing sensitive documents would damage Romania's international reputation or compromise national security. It took repeated legal challenges and sustained public pressure to force the gradual release of archival materials throughout the 1990s and 2000s. When documents were finally released, they often confirmed the worst suspicions about the camp's operation while revealing new dimensions of the horror that even survivors had not fully understood. Internal reports showed that the high mortality rates were not accidental byproducts of harsh conditions, but were anticipated and accepted as necessary costs of the project's political objectives. The medical evidence provided particularly compelling documentation of the camp's systematic brutality. When survivors were finally able to undergo comprehensive medical examinations, doctors found evidence of malnutrition, untreated injuries, and long-term health effects that were consistent with prolonged exposure to extreme physical hardship. These medical findings provided objective corroboration of survivor testimonies that might otherwise have been dismissed as subjective or exaggerated. Archaeological investigations at former campsites have provided additional evidence, though these efforts have been limited by the thoroughness of the original cover-up operations. Where excavations have been possible, researchers have discovered mass grave sites, foundations of destroyed buildings, and artifacts that confirm the existence of large-scale detention facilities in areas that official records claimed had never housed such installations. The legal pursuit of justice for canal crimes has been largely unsuccessful. By the time serious investigations became possible, most of the senior officials responsible for the camps were elderly or had died. Additionally, the legal framework of post-communist Romania was not well suited to prosecuting crimes committed decades earlier under a different political system. A few symbolic prosecutions were attempted, but most ended in acquittals or minimal sentences that were widely viewed as inadequate. The social and psychological impact of truth-seeking efforts has been complex. For survivors, the opportunity to finally speak about their experiences has often been therapeutic, providing a sense of validation and recognition that had been denied for decades. However, the process has also been traumatic, forcing elderly individuals to relive some of the most painful experiences of their lives. For Romanian society as a whole, confronting the canal tragedy has been part of a broader reckoning with the communist past that has proven difficult and divisive. While some citizens have embraced efforts to document and remember the crimes of the former regime, others have preferred to focus on the present and future rather than revisiting painful historical episodes. The international response to revelations about the canal tragedy has been generally supportive but limited in practical impact. International human rights organizations have documented the Romanian findings and included them in broader studies of communist-era crimes. However, the canal story has not received the same level of international attention as comparable tragedies in other countries, partly because Romania's strategic importance has made other countries reluctant to focus too heavily on historical grievances. Educational efforts to ensure that younger generations learn about the canal tragedy have had mixed success. Some schools now include brief discussions of the camps in their modern history curricula, and a few textbooks mention the forced labor projects of the early 1950s. However, the topic is still not covered comprehensively in most educational settings, and many young Romanians remain unaware of this chapter of their country's history. The digital age has created new opportunities for preserving and disseminating information about the canal tragedy. Online databases have been created to document survivors' testimonies, digitize historical documents, and map the locations of former camps. These resources have made it easier for researchers and interested citizens to access information that was previously difficult to obtain. Despite decades of investigation and documentation, significant gaps remain in our understanding of the canal tragedy. The exact number of victims may never be known, the locations of many mass graves remain unidentified, and the personal stories of thousands of individuals who died in the camps have been lost forever. The success of the original cover-up operation means that some aspects of this historical crime will likely remain forever shrouded in mystery. More than 70 years after the first deportations to the Canal of Death, Romanian society continues to grapple with how to remember and commemorate this tragedy. The response has been characterized by official recognition coupled with practical neglect, symbolic gestures accompanied by substantive inaction, and widespread public awareness coexisting with persistent denial and minimization. In 2006, the Romanian Parliament established August 15th as the Day of Commemoration of the Victims of Communist Camps, a gesture that represented official acknowledgement of the canal tragedy and similar crimes committed during the communist period. However, the annual commemorations have typically been small, poorly publicized events that attract minimal public attention and generate little sustained discussion about the historical events they are meant to remember. The legal framework for addressing communist-era crimes remains inadequate and inconsistently applied. While Romania has officially condemned the former regime and recognized the suffering of its victims, the practical mechanisms for providing redress to survivors and their families have been limited and bureaucratic. Many survivors have died while waiting for official recognition of their suffering or compensation for their losses. Educational institutions have been slow to integrate the Canal tragedy into their curricula in any meaningful way. While the topic is mentioned in some history textbooks and university courses, it is rarely given the comprehensive treatment that its historical significance would seem to warrant. Many teachers report feeling unprepared to discuss such sensitive material, and some express concern about potential political or social backlash from addressing controversial historical topics. Public opinion surveys conducted in recent years reveal a complex and often contradictory set of attitudes toward the communist period and its crimes. While substantial majorities of Romanians acknowledge that serious human rights abuses occurred during the communist era, smaller percentages express detailed knowledge about specific events like the Canal project. There appears to be a disconnect between general awareness of communist crimes and specific understanding of particular tragedies. The physical landscape of the former canal camps reflects this ambivalent approach to historical memory. While some sites have been marked with modest memorial plaques or monuments, many former camp locations remain completely unmarked and indistinguishable from the surrounding countryside. The contrast with Holocaust memorial sites in other parts of Europe is striking and has been noted by international visitors and human rights organizations. Tourism to the Canal region focuses almost entirely on the completed waterway's technical achievements and scenic beauty, with minimal reference to the human costs of its construction. Tour guides typically emphasize the engineering challenges that were overcome and the economic benefits that the canal has provided, while mentioning the forced labor period only in passing, if at all. Media coverage of canal-related anniversaries and commemorative events tends to be brief and formulaic, focusing on ceremonial aspects rather than substantive discussion of the historical events or their contemporary relevance. Investigative journalism about remaining unanswered questions related to the Canal tragedy is rare, and when it does occur, it typically receives limited public attention. The political discourse around the Canal tragedy reflects broader divisions in Romanian society about how to understand and remember the communist period. Conservative politicians often emphasize the need to move beyond historical grievances and focus on contemporary challenges, while liberal voices argue for more comprehensive accountability and remembrance efforts. These political divisions have made it difficult to develop a sustained bipartisan approach to dealing with this historical legacy. Survivors and their families continue to face practical challenges in documenting their experiences and seeking recognition for their suffering. The bureaucratic processes for obtaining official acknowledgement of political persecution are complex and often require documentation that may have been destroyed or was never created in the first place. Many elderly survivors report feeling frustrated by these administrative obstacles and by what they perceive as insufficient societal interest in their experiences. International comparisons highlight both the progress that Romania has made in addressing its communist past and the limitations of those efforts. Countries like Germany and Czech Republic have developed more comprehensive approaches to documenting and commemorating communist-era crimes, including better-funded memorial sites, more extensive educational programs, and more systematic efforts to preserve survivor testimonies. The rise of social media and digital communication has created new opportunities for preserving and sharing information about the Canal tragedy, but it has also facilitated the spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories. Some online discussions of the topic are characterized by historical negationism or attempts to minimize the scope of the crimes that were committed. Academic research on the Canal tragedy continues, but it faces ongoing challenges related to limited funding, restricted access to some archival materials, and the advanced age of the remaining witnesses. International scholarly interest in the topic has been moderate, reflecting the broader pattern of limited global awareness of Romanian communist crimes compared to similar events in other countries. The Catholic and Orthodox churches in Romania have played a limited role in commemoration efforts, despite the fact that many of the Canal victims were clergy or religious believers who were targeted specifically because of their faith. While some religious leaders have spoken out about the importance of remembering the victims, the churches as institutions have not made the Canal tragedy a central focus of their historical witness or social teaching. Contemporary Romanian culture has produced relatively few artistic works, novels, films, documentaries, or other creative expressions that deal seriously with the Canal tragedy. This stands in contrast to other countries where communist-era crimes have inspired significant cultural production that has helped maintain public awareness and understanding of historical events. The ongoing presence in Romanian society of former communist officials and their descendants has complicated efforts to achieve a full reckoning with the past. While the most senior perpetrators of Canal crimes have died, many individuals who held lower-level positions in the communist apparatus remain alive and sometimes continue to hold positions of influence in business, politics, or other sectors of society. The story of the Canal of Death is not merely a historical curiosity or a tragic footnote to the broader narrative of 20th century European history. Rather, it represents a case study in how democratic societies can rapidly descend into systematic barbarism, how totalitarian regimes implement and conceal mass murder, and how societies struggle to confront and learn from their own darkest chapters. The speed with which Romania transformed from a functioning, if imperfect, democracy into a state capable of systematic murder is perhaps the most unsettling lesson of the Canal tragedy. In 1946, Romania had competitive elections, a free press, active political parties, and legal protections for individual rights. By 1950, the same country was implementing a forced labor system that rivaled anything created by Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia. The transition took less than 4 years. This transformation was not the result of foreign invasion or natural disaster, but of deliberate political choices made by individuals who understood exactly what they were doing. The architects of the Canal project were not madmen or fanatics, but calculating politicians who saw mass murder as an efficient solution to their political problems. They created legal frameworks to justify their crimes, bureaucratic systems to implement them systematically, and propaganda campaigns to conceal them from public view. The international dimension of the tragedy also holds contemporary relevance. The Canal crimes were committed by a government that was internationally recognized, participated in international organizations, and maintained diplomatic relations with countries around the world. The international community's failure to prevent or respond to these crimes was not due to lack of information, but to other political priorities that made intervention inconvenient or impossible. The role of ordinary citizens in enabling and perpetrating these crimes provides sobering insights into human behavior under extreme political pressure. The guards who brutalized prisoners, the bureaucrats who organized deportations, and the neighbors who informed on each other were not inherently evil people, but individuals who were placed in a system that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion. Their behavior suggests that similar transformations could occur in other societies under similar circumstances. The systematic nature of the cover-up operation demonstrates how totalitarian regimes can manipulate information and memory to conceal even massive crimes. The Romanian authorities did not simply deny that the Canal crimes had occurred. They created an alternative version of reality that was so comprehensive and convincing that many people who lived through the period came to doubt their own memories and experiences. The long-term effects of these crimes on Romanian society illustrate how historical trauma can persist across generations, affecting not only direct victims, but entire communities and cultures. The Canal tragedy damaged Romanian social trust, undermined faith in government institutions, and created patterns of fear and silence that continued long after the communist regime's collapse. The incomplete nature of post-communist accountability efforts provides lessons about the challenges of transitional justice and the importance of addressing historical crimes promptly and comprehensively. Romania's failure to fully confront the Canal tragedy has left wounds that continue to fester decades later, contributing to political polarization and social dysfunction that affect the country's development today. Contemporary relevance can be found in the ways that authoritarian movements around the world continue to use similar techniques of dehumanization, systematic violence, and information manipulation to achieve their goals. While the specific circumstances of the Canal tragedy were unique to 1950s Romania, the underlying patterns of authoritarian behavior remain remarkably consistent across different times and places. The story also demonstrates the crucial importance of preserving historical memory and resisting attempts to minimize or deny documented atrocities. The success of the Romanian cover-up operation shows how quickly historical truth can be lost if societies do not make sustained efforts to document and remember their past, particularly its most painful aspects. For international audiences, the Canal tragedy serves as a reminder that crimes against humanity are not limited to the most notorious regimes or the most well-documented historical periods. Systematic murder and abuse have occurred in many societies that are not typically associated with such extreme behavior, and vigilance is required to prevent similar crimes in the future. The technological and bureaucratic sophistication of the Canal project also provides insights into how modern states can weaponize their administrative capacities for criminal purposes. The same organizational skills and technical expertise that can be used to build infrastructure and provide public services can also be employed to implement genocide and conceal evidence of massive crimes. As we reach the end of this investigation into one of Eastern Europe's most horrific yet least known tragedies, we must grapple with uncomfortable questions about our own responsibilities as inheritors of this history. The Canal of Death is not merely a Romanian story or even just a communist story. It is a human story that reveals both our capacity for evil and our obligation to remember and learn from the darkest chapters of our shared past. The thousands who died in the Dobruja marshes were not abstract victims of historical forces beyond human control. They were individuals with names, families, dreams, and aspirations who were systematically murdered by other human beings who made deliberate choices to value political power over human life. Their deaths were not inevitable consequences of ideological struggle, but preventable crimes that occurred because too many people remained silent, looked away, or actively participated in systems they knew to be evil. Today, as democratic institutions face challenges around the world and authoritarian movements gain strength in multiple countries, the lessons of the Canal of Death become urgently relevant. The techniques of dehumanization, systematic violence, and information manipulation that enabled the Romanian tragedy continue to be employed by those who seek power through fear and division. Recognizing these patterns and understanding their historical consequences is essential for preventing their repetition. The incomplete nature of accountability for canal crimes also provides important lessons about the necessity of prompt and comprehensive responses to mass atrocities. Romania's failure to fully confront this tragedy in the immediate post-communist period has had lasting consequences for the country's democratic development and social cohesion. Other societies facing similar choices about how to deal with their own dark histories would be wise to learn from Romania's example. For those of us who research, document, and share these stories, we bear a special responsibility to ensure that the voices of victims are heard and their experiences are not forgotten or minimized. The survivors who courageously shared their testimonies, often at great personal cost, did so in the hope that their suffering might serve some larger purpose in preventing future tragedies. Honoring their courage requires more than passive remembrance. It demands active engagement with the lessons of their experiences. The digital age provides unprecedented opportunities for preserving and sharing historical testimony, but it also creates new challenges related to misinformation and historical negationism. Those committed to truth-telling must be vigilant in maintaining the accuracy and integrity of historical records while making them accessible to new generations who may have no direct connection to these events. Educational institutions at all levels have a crucial role to play in ensuring that younger generations understand both the specific facts of tragedies like the Canal of Death and the broader patterns of human behavior that make such tragedies possible. This education must go beyond simple memorization of dates and statistics to include serious engagement with the moral and ethical questions that these events raise about human nature and political responsibility. International cooperation in documenting and commemorating communist-era crimes remains important for ensuring that these events receive the global attention they deserve, and that lessons learned in one country can benefit others facing similar challenges. The canal tragedy should be understood not as an isolated Romanian experience, but as part of the broader pattern of 20th century atrocities that affected multiple countries and millions of victims. For individual citizens, regardless of nationality, the Canal of Death serves as a reminder of the importance of civic engagement, moral courage, and resistance to the normalization of cruelty and injustice. The Romanian tragedy occurred not because an entire society was inherently evil, but because too many good people remained passive, while evil was implemented systematically around them. The canal exists today as a functioning waterway that serves Romania's economy and provides employment for thousands of people. Ships pass daily through waters that cover the unmarked graves of forced laborers, and tourists enjoy recreational cruises while remaining unaware of the human cost of the route they are traveling. This juxtaposition of normal life proceeding over sites of historical horror is not unique to Romania, but it serves as a powerful metaphor for how societies manage to function despite carrying enormous burdens of unresolved historical trauma. As we conclude this examination of the Canal of Death, we must commit ourselves to ensuring that the thousands who died in its construction are not forgotten, that their stories continue to be told, and that the lessons of their tragedy continue to inform our understanding of human rights, political responsibility, and the fragility of civilized society. The canal may have been completed through modern engineering and paid labor, but it will forever remain a monument to both human cruelty and human resilience. The victims who died building it with their bare hands achieved a form of immortality through our commitment to remembering their stories and learning from their sacrifice. In telling these stories, we honor not only their memory, but our own humanity. This is why history matters. This is why truth-telling matters. This is why we must never stop asking uncomfortable questions about power, authority, and the systems we create in our names. The Canal of Death reminds us that civilization is fragile, that barbarism can emerge quickly in any society, and that our best defense against future tragedies is the courage to confront honestly the tragedies of our past. In the name of those thousands whose bones rest beneath the waters of the Danube Black Sea Canal, in the service of truth that transcends political convenience, and in hope for a future where such crimes become impossible rather than merely unlikely, we must remember, we must learn, and we must never allow ourselves to forget.